My mom found out I've been helping my bullied younger sibling with homework every night for 2 years while dealing with my own severe depression. And she broke down crying when she realized I was drowning. When my mother realized that I had been slowly disappearing for 2 years while no one was paying attention, she broke down in a way that I'd never seen before. She broke down with a kind of profound guilt that seemed to crack something fundamental inside her. And in that moment, everything in our family changed. It started with homework. That's what makes this story so insidious, I think. It started with something so simple and so good that no one recognized it was actually a symptom of something that was destroying me from the inside out. My sibling's name was Oliver, and he was 13 years old when I was 22. Oliver was the kind of kid who didn't fit anywhere, who couldn't find his place among his peers, who was mocked and excluded and made to feel like there was something fundamentally wrong with him just because he was different. He had always been sensitive, always been a little anxious, always struggled with the social codes that came so naturally to other children. And by the time he was 13, that sensitivity and that anxiety had made him a target. The bullying started in his first year of secondary school. It was subtle at first. Comments under his breath, exclusion from group projects, the way kids would edge away from him in the corridors like his difference was contagious. But it escalated the way these things do until by the time I really paid attention to what was happening, Oliver was coming home every day looking like he'd been through a war. He would drop his backpack by the door with this defeated heaviness that broke my heart. He would go straight to his room and close the door. He would skip dinner sometimes and just lie in bed, his face turned toward the wall. My parents noticed this, I think, but they didn't know how to handle it. My father suggested that Oliver needed to toughen up, that kids were always mean and you just had to learn to deal with it. My mother suggested that maybe Oliver was being too sensitive, that if he just tried harder to fit in, the other kids would accept him. Neither of them understood that you can't fit into a place that has deliberately excluded you. Neither of them understood that telling someone to be less sensitive when they're being bullied is just another form of rejection. So I stepped in. I don't remember making a conscious decision to do it. I just remember one evening coming home from my job as a junior graphic designer and finding Oliver slumped at the kitchen table, staring at his math homework like it was written in a language he didn't understand. And I sat down across from him and said, "Do you want help?" The relief in his eyes was so profound that it broke my heart all over again. That first homework session turned into a second, and the second into a third, and before I knew what was happening, I was helping Oliver with his homework every single night. Every night after I came home from work. Every night after I'd spent the day staring at computer screens trying to be creative, trying to be present, trying to do my job while something in my head was slowly unraveling. I didn't recognize what was happening to me at first. Depression is insidious that way. It creeps up on you so gradually that you don't notice the moment when you stop being sad about things and start being numb about everything. You don't notice when the effort it takes to get out of bed in the morning becomes something that requires a kind of superhuman strength. You don't notice when you stop calling your friends back, when you stop answering invitations, when the thought of being around other people starts to feel physically painful. But I was helping Oliver, and that was good. That was something I could point to and say, I'm doing something right. I'm helping someone. And helping someone was enough of a reason to get up in the morning, enough of a reason to keep going, enough of a reason to ignore the fact that I was falling apart. The depression started small. It was just this persistent heaviness, this sense that everything required more effort than it should, this fog that seemed to cloud every decision and every interaction. I would go to work and sit at my desk and try to design graphics that were creative and interesting, but everything I made felt flat and lifeless, like it was missing some essential spark. My boss started pulling me aside to ask if everything was okay, if there was something going on, if I needed any support. I told her that everything was fine. I told her that I was just tired. I told her that things would improve once I got more sleep. But I wasn't getting more sleep. Every night I was coming home and sitting with Oliver and helping him work through his assignments. And then, after he went to bed, I would sit up late scrolling through social media, telling myself that I would go to bed soon but never quite making it. And then my alarm would go off at 6 in the morning and I would drag myself out of bed and go back to work, and the cycle would repeat. Oliver was getting better. That was the thing that made it all feel worth it. His grades were improving. His teachers started commenting on his progress. He seemed more confident when he came home from school, like maybe the bullying was bothering him less because at least one person in his life was making it clear that he was worth helping. But while Oliver was getting better, I was getting worse. The depression deepened. It wasn't just heaviness anymore. It became something more active, more aggressive. My thoughts started to get darker. I found myself lying in bed in the morning and thinking about all the ways the world would be better off without me. I found myself at work looking out the window and calculating whether it would hurt if I jumped. I found myself having these intrusive thoughts that would come out of nowhere and make me feel sick with shame because I couldn't understand why my brain was doing this to me. I was functioning on the surface. I was going to work. I was coming home and helping Oliver with his homework. I was eating at least one meal a day most of the time. I was showering occasionally. I was doing all the things that made it look like I was okay. But I was drowning and no one could see it. My parents were preoccupied with their own problems. My father was dealing with some issues at his company that had him stressed and irritable. My mother was dealing with her mother's health problems and spending a lot of time at the hospital. They were in their own worlds, dealing with their own crises, and I was grateful for that, honestly. If they had been paying close attention to me, I would have had to do the emotional labor of reassuring them that I was okay, and I didn't have any emotional labor left to give. I was using every ounce of energy I had to help Oliver and to keep myself alive, and there was nothing left for anyone else. I didn't tell anyone how depressed I was. I didn't tell my parents, didn't tell my friends, didn't tell anyone at work. The only person who had any idea that something was wrong was my therapist, Dr. Patel, and even with her, I wasn't entirely honest about how dark things had gotten. Dr. Patel had come into my life about a year before I started helping Oliver, recommended to me by a friend who thought I might benefit from talking to someone about my anxiety. I'd started going once a month, which became once every 2 weeks, which became once a week as my mental health declined. But even with Dr. Patel, I was holding back. I was telling her about my depression without telling her about the suicidal thoughts. I was telling her that I was stressed about work without telling her that I couldn't imagine myself having a future. "You seem to be carrying a lot right now," Dr. Patel said one day, and I remember thinking that she had no idea how much I was actually carrying. She had no idea that I was holding up my siblings' entire world on my shoulders while my own world was collapsing. 2 years. For 2 years I helped Oliver with his homework every single night. For 2 years I sat at the kitchen table and worked through algebra problems, explained the themes in classic literature, helped him organize his thoughts for essays. For 2 years I listened to him talk about his day, about what had happened at school, about which kids had been mean to him today, and I told him that it wasn't his fault, that he was a good person, that the other kids didn't understand him and that was their loss. And I meant every word of it. I did. Even as my own thoughts were telling me that I was worthless, I was telling Oliver that he was worth something. Even as I was thinking about ways to end my own life, I was trying to help Oliver find ways to make his life better. It's a particular kind of torture, that contradiction. It's a particular kind of pain to be aware of your own hypocrisy while you're living it. To know that you're telling your sibling that their life matters while you're not sure that yours does. To know that you're telling them to reach out for help while you're too ashamed and too scared to reach out yourself. By the end of those 2 years, I was surviving on very little sleep and very little food and a lot of caffeine. I was going through my days in a fog, moving from one task to the next without really being present. At work, I was struggling to concentrate, struggling to come up with ideas, struggling to care about whether my work was good or whether I would ever have a career. At home, I was doing the homework thing and then disappearing into my room and sitting in the dark, sometimes crying, sometimes not feeling anything at all. I had stopped seeing my friends. I had stopped answering calls and texts. I had stopped going to social events. The world had contracted to just work and home and Oliver and the constant, exhausting effort of pretending to be okay. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. Oliver came home upset about something that had happened at school. Some kids had circulated a video on social media making fun of him, making jokes about his appearance, his voice, the way he walked. It was brutal and cruel and entirely designed to hurt him. And when he told me about it, something inside me just snapped. I sat down across from Oliver and I started to cry. Not delicate tears, but these deep, racking sobs that came from somewhere inside my chest that I didn't even know existed anymore. I cried because I was so tired. I cried because I was so angry at the world for being cruel to this child who had never done anything to deserve it. I cried because I realized that I had been pouring all of my energy into helping him and I still couldn't protect him from the pain. I cried because I finally acknowledged that I couldn't keep doing this. That I couldn't keep holding both of our lives up. That something had to break and it was going to be me. Oliver was frightened by my breakdown. He started crying too, and he was asking if it was his fault, if I was crying because of him, if he shouldn't have told me about the video. And I had to pull myself together enough to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that none of this was his fault, that he hadn't done anything wrong. But I was broken and I couldn't hide it anymore. My mother came home from work about 20 minutes after my breakdown. She came into the kitchen and found me sitting at the table with Oliver, both of us with red eyes, and she could immediately tell that something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, and Oliver started to tell her about the video. And she listened to Oliver's story, and she was appropriately concerned and angry about the bullying. But then she really looked at me, and I think that's when she saw it. I think that's when she saw that I was falling apart. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, and she said it gently, not accusingly, just with this deep concern that made something inside me crack all over again. "Nothing," I said, but my voice was shaking. "I'm fine. I just had a moment." And my mother, who is not a fool, sat down at the table and she said, "Tell me the truth." I didn't want to. I wanted to get up and go to my room and pretend that nothing was happening. I wanted to reassure her that everything was fine and that she didn't need to worry about me. But I was so tired of lying, and I was so tired of pretending, and I was so tired of carrying this weight alone. So I told her the truth. I told my mother about the depression. I told her about the dark thoughts, the intrusive suicidal ideation, the way I had been struggling to get out of bed in the morning, the way I had been isolating myself from friends, the way my work had been suffering, the way I had been barely eating, barely sleeping, barely functioning as a human being. And I told her about the homework sessions. I told her that for 2 years, I had been helping Oliver every single night. I told her that I had been doing it because I couldn't stand to watch him suffer, because I thought that if I could just help him enough, if I could just be there for him enough, then maybe he wouldn't be so hurt by the cruelty of the world. I told her that I had been doing it because I didn't know how to say no, because helping Oliver was the only thing that made me feel like I was worth anything. And my mother, as I was telling her all of this, started to cry. But these weren't small tears. These were the kind of sobs that came from a place of profound guilt and horror and a terrible realization of what she had missed. "Oh my God," she said, and she kept saying it over and over. "Oh my God, I didn't know. I didn't see it. I didn't see that you were drowning." She put her arms around me and she held me while I cried, and she told me that she was so sorry, that she should have been paying more attention, that she should have seen that something was wrong, that she should have asked me more directly how I was doing instead of just accepting my surface-level reassurances that everything was fine. And Oliver, sitting at the table with us, started to cry too, because he realized that his suffering, the thing he'd been trying so hard to survive, had inadvertently caused suffering in his older sibling. He realized that by being bullied, by needing help, he had inadvertently become part of the system that was destroying me. "This is not your fault," I told him immediately, seeing the guilt on his face. "None of this is your fault. You didn't make me depressed. You didn't make me unable to ask for help. That's all on me." But something had shifted. The secret was out. The truth had been exposed, and there was no going back to pretending. The conversation that followed that evening lasted until midnight. My mother wanted to know everything. She wanted to understand how I'd gotten to this place, why I hadn't told anyone, why I'd been carrying this alone for so long. And I tried to explain it to her, tried to make her understand that depression isn't something you can just decide to stop feeling, that it creeps up on you gradually so that you don't notice that you've been sinking, that asking for help feels like an impossible task when you're in the grip of it. "I didn't want to be a burden," I told her. "You and Dad were dealing with your own stuff. Oliver was struggling. I didn't want to add my problems on top of everything else." "But you were suffering," my mother said, and her voice was fierce. "You were suffering and you dealt with it alone, and that was never supposed to be your job. That was never supposed to be your responsibility." She asked me when the last time was that I'd eaten a proper meal. She asked me when the last time was that I'd slept for more than 4 hours. She asked me if I was still seeing Dr. Patel. She asked me if I'd ever told Dr. Patel how dark my thoughts had gotten. When I admitted that I hadn't, that I'd been downplaying the severity of my depression even in therapy, my mother went very still. "You need help," she said. "Real help. Not just therapy once a week. You need to talk to a doctor. You need to consider medication. You need to actually, genuinely take care of yourself instead of pretending to take care of yourself." "But Oliver still needs help," I said, and my mother shook her head. "Oliver will survive without you helping him with homework every night," my mother said. "Oliver will not survive if his older sibling kills himself. That is the priority now. Your survival is the priority." The next day, my mother called Dr. Patel and asked if she could see me urgently. Dr. Patel had an opening the following morning and my mother took off work to go with me. When I walked into Dr. Patel's office, the first thing she said was, "Your mother has filled me in on some things. I want to hear from you directly about what's been going on." And I told her everything. I told her about the 2 years of helping Oliver, about the depression that had gradually gotten worse, about the suicidal thoughts that had been with me for the past 6 months, about the specific plans I had made, about the fact that the only reason I was still alive was because I couldn't figure out how to leave Oliver without making him feel guilty. Dr. Patel listened to all of this and then she did something I wasn't expecting. She pulled out her computer and made an appointment for me with a psychiatrist. She told me that I needed to be evaluated for medication, that I needed more support than weekly therapy could provide, that what I was describing sounded like major depressive disorder that had gone untreated for long enough that it had become dangerous. "I want you to be very clear about something," Dr. Patel said, looking me directly in the eyes. "What you've been doing for the past 2 years, helping your sibling while your own mental health deteriorated, that took strength. That took sacrifice. But it was not sustainable and it was not your job. Your job is to take care of yourself. Everything else comes second to that." Getting on antidepressants was a turning point that I hadn't anticipated. I'd been resistant to medication for a long time, had this belief that if I just tried hard enough, if I just had the right mindset, if I just did enough therapy, then I could fix this without medication. I had internalized the stigma around mental health medication, had bought into the narrative that taking antidepressants meant that I was weak or broken or that I was giving up on fixing myself. But the first medication I was prescribed didn't work particularly well, so the psychiatrist switched me to something else. And about 2 weeks into taking the new medication, something extraordinary happened. The fog lifted. Not entirely and not permanently, but enough that I could suddenly see that there was a world beyond my depression, that there were things worth living for, that my life didn't have to be just about surviving and helping my siblings survive. I was able to go to work and actually care about my job again. I was able to return calls from friends who had been trying to stay in touch. I was able to eat full meals without feeling like I was forcing myself. I was able to sleep for 8 hours and wake up feeling like I'd actually rested. It wasn't a cure and I knew that it wasn't permanent, but it was enough to make me realize that the way I had been living for the past 2 years wasn't normal, wasn't healthy, wasn't sustainable. I also had to have a conversation with Oliver about the homework situation. My mother had already talked to him about it, had explained to him that me helping him with homework every single night wasn't healthy for me, that I needed to take a step back and focus on my own mental health. Oliver had been resistant to this initially, worried that his grades would suffer, worried that he would go back to struggling in school. But when I sat down with him and explained what was happening inside my head, when I told him about the depression and the suicidal thoughts and the way that everything had been getting darker and darker, he understood. He was frightened, I think, by how close I had come to not being around anymore. But he understood that me continuing to help him every night was not actually helping either of us. "I'm sorry," he said, and he cried, and I held him and I told him that he didn't have anything to apologize for. "You were dealing with bullying," I said. "You were a kid who needed help. It's not your fault that you needed help. And it's not your fault that I didn't ask for help in return." I told him that I would still help him with homework when he needed it, but that it was going to be different now. I was going to set boundaries. I was going to say no sometimes. I was going to prioritize my own mental health. My mother also started looking into additional support for Oliver. She hired a tutor so that he wouldn't be relying on me for academic help. She looked into counseling for him to help him process the bullying and the social anxiety that had developed as a result of being excluded and mocked by his peers. She reached out to the school and requested that they address the bullying more directly, that they implement some interventions to help Oliver find his place among his peers. It turned out that the school had been aware of the bullying to some extent, but they hadn't realized how severe it was or how much it was affecting Oliver. When my mother made it clear that she was serious about getting the situation addressed, they actually started taking it seriously too. About 3 months after I had my breakdown and told my mother the truth, I made the decision to take a leave of absence from work. My psychiatrist had suggested it, my therapist had supported it, and honestly, I needed it. I'd been pushing myself to work while also recovering from 2 years of depression, and I could feel myself starting to crack again at the edges. My boss was understanding about it. She told me that she'd noticed that I'd seemed out of it for a while, and she was glad that I was finally taking the time to take care of myself. She told me to take whatever time I needed and that my job would be here when I was ready to come back. For the first time in years, I had time and space to just be. I didn't have to be the successful graphic designer. I didn't have to be the supportive older sibling. I didn't have to be the person who had it all together. I could just be someone who was recovering from a serious mental illness, and that was enough. The turning point in my relationship with my parents came about 6 months after I'd told my mother the truth. My mother had been doing her own processing, had been reading books about depression, had been talking to other people whose family members had struggled with mental health, had been grappling with the guilt of not seeing what was happening to me earlier. She'd started going to therapy herself, partly to work through that guilt, partly to understand her own issues that had contributed to the family dynamic that had made it possible for me to sacrifice myself for Oliver. And one evening she asked if we could all sit down together. Me, her, my father, and Oliver. "I need to apologize," she said, looking at me. "I need to tell you that I failed you. I was so caught up in my own problems that I didn't see what was happening to you. I didn't ask you directly how you were doing. I didn't notice that you were struggling. And most importantly, I didn't teach you that your mental health and your well-being are important and worth protecting." She looked at my father. "We both failed you," she said. "We were so focused on trying to solve Oliver's bullying problem that we didn't see that we had another problem right in front of us. We didn't see that you were drowning. And for that I am deeply, sincerely sorry." My father nodded, and he added his own apology. He said that he wished he had paid more attention, that he wished he had asked more direct questions, that he wished he had been more present in our lives instead of being caught up in his own work stress. "Your mental health is not something you should ever have to manage alone," my father said. "And I wish that I had been there to help you carry that burden instead of leaving you to carry it yourself." Oliver cried when he heard this, because he finally understood that none of what had happened was his fault, that his being bullied didn't cause my depression, that he wasn't responsible for my mental health or my survival. The crisis and the comeback weren't one big dramatic moment. They were a series of small moments, small choices, small steps in the direction of healing. It was the moment when I finally admitted to Dr. Patel how dark my thoughts had gotten. It was the moment when I started taking medication and felt the fog lift. It was the moment when my mother discovered that I'd been drowning and decided that my survival was important enough to be a priority in the family. It was the moment when I set boundaries with Oliver and told him that I couldn't be everything to him. It was the moment when my parents acknowledged their own failures and apologized genuinely. And it was also the small moments in between. It was the day I got out of bed and showered without it feeling like a monumental task. It was the day I called my friend back and made plans to get coffee. It was the day I did something creative just for myself, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. It was the day I realized that I actually had value as a person, separate from what I could do for other people. About a year after I told my mother the truth, I was ready to go back to work. I'd been off for about 6 months, and I'd spent that time working with my therapist on developing healthier coping mechanisms, on learning how to set boundaries, on understanding the root causes of my depression and my tendency to sacrifice myself for others. When I went back to work, things were different. I was different. I was still managing my depression with medication and therapy, but I was also actively working to take care of myself. I was saying no to extra projects when I didn't have the capacity to take them on. I was leaving the office at a reasonable hour instead of staying late. I was eating lunch at my desk instead of skipping it. I was taking breaks when I needed them instead of powering through. My boss noticed the difference. She said that I seemed more present, more engaged, more like myself. And I realized that she had never actually known myself before. She'd only ever known the version of me that was barely holding it together. Oliver's life improved too, though not in the dramatic way that I'd imagined it would when I was helping him with homework every night. The bullying didn't just go away because he got good grades. But with the school's intervention, with his counselor helping him develop better coping strategies, with the tutor taking pressure off of him academically, he was able to start recovering from some of the damage that the bullying had caused. He found a friend in his second year of secondary school, a girl named Phoebe who was also on the outside of the social hierarchy and who understood what it felt like to not fit in. And having even one genuine friend made a huge difference in his ability to survive the school day. He started to have more confidence. He started to hold himself differently. He started to seem less broken by the cruelty of his peers. And the thing that surprised me was that we actually became closer after I stopped helping him with homework every night. We had time to just hang out without there being an agenda, without there being academic work to get through. We could talk about things that mattered to us, share our thoughts and our feelings, just be together without the underlying current of him needing something from me. The most beautiful part of this story came during a conversation I had with my mother about a year and a half after I'd told her the truth. We were sitting in her car waiting for Oliver after one of his therapy sessions, and she asked me something that she'd been wanting to ask for a while. "Do you forgive me?" she asked. "For not seeing what was happening to you? For not being there when you were struggling?" I thought about this for a long time before I answered, because the truth was more complicated than just yes or no. "I think forgiveness implies that there's something to forgive," I said finally. "And I don't think you did anything wrong, really. You were dealing with your own stress and your own problems. You were trying to help Oliver. You weren't deliberately ignoring what was happening to me. You just didn't see it." "But I should have," my mother said. "I'm your mother. I should have asked. I should have paid more attention." "Maybe," I said. "But the thing is, I wasn't really giving you anything to see. I was hiding. I was pretending that everything was fine. I was lying about how I was doing. If you had asked me directly how I was doing, I probably would have lied to your face and said I was fine. So how much of this is really your responsibility?" My mother was quiet for a moment. "So you don't think you need to forgive me?" she asked. "I think what I need to do is understand that we both made mistakes," I said. "I made the mistake of sacrificing myself for someone else. You made the mistake of not asking hard questions when the surface-level answers didn't quite add up. Neither of us is a villain in this story. We're both just people who were trying to do the best we could with what we had." I reached over and took her hand. "What I'm grateful for," I continued, "is that when you finally did see what was happening, you acted. You took it seriously. You prioritized my survival. You apologized for not seeing sooner. And you've done the work to understand what happened and to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's what matters to me." 2 years after I had my breakdown, I was in a much better place. My depression was being managed with medication and therapy. I was working a job that I actually enjoyed and that didn't consume all of my energy. I had friends who I saw regularly. I had hobbies that I'd started doing again. Photography, which I'd loved before depression had stolen it from me. I was sleeping well, eating well, taking care of myself. I was also in a healthier place in my relationship with Oliver. We were still close, but it was a healthier kind of closeness. I was his older sibling, but not his savior. I was someone who cared about him and would help him when he needed help, but I was no longer the one carrying the weight of his survival. Oliver had also improved significantly. The school's intervention had helped. His therapy had helped. Finding a friend had helped. But I also think that understanding that my breakdown wasn't his fault had helped him. He realized that his existence wasn't a burden on the people around him, that he wasn't responsible for managing everyone else's emotions or mental health. The really beautiful part of this story, though, came when I decided to go back to therapy and work on understanding why I'd been so willing to sacrifice myself for Oliver in the first place. With Dr. Patel, I explored the roots of this tendency. Where did I learn that my value was tied to what I could do for others? Where did I learn that saying no was selfish? Where did I learn that my own mental health and well-being were less important than everyone else's? Some of it came from my family, from the way that both my parents had modeled the idea that you take care of others first and yourself second. Some of it came from being the oldest sibling, from the implicit expectation that I would be the responsible one, the strong one, the one who had it together. But some of it also came from deeper in my psyche, from a kind of fundamental belief that I was only worthwhile if I was useful, that my existence was only justified if I was helping someone else. Working on changing that belief has been one of the hardest things I've ever done. But it's also been one of the most important. The beautiful ending to this story is that my family, after going through this crisis together, became closer and more honest with each other. We learned to talk about the things that were hard. We learned to acknowledge when we were struggling. We learned to ask for help instead of suffering in silence. My mother now regularly asks me directly how I'm doing, not just the surface level, "How was your day?" but the deeper, "Are you taking care of yourself? Are you struggling with anything? Do you need help with anything?" And I've learned to answer her honestly instead of just saying that everything is fine. My father has been more present. He's been more interested in what's going on in our lives. He's acknowledged his own tendency to get caught up in work and has been making a more conscious effort to maintain emotional connection with his children. And Oliver, instead of being the damaged child who needs protecting, is becoming a well-adjusted young person who understands that having mental health challenges and needing help is not shameful. He's learned that the world can be cruel, but that there are also good things and good people. He's learned that he has value just because he exists, not because of what he can do or what his grades are. 3 years after my breakdown, I was having lunch with my mother and she said something that made me cry. "I want to thank you," she said, "for being honest about what was happening. For finally telling me that you were drowning. Because if you hadn't, I would have gone on thinking that everything was fine, and you would have gone on suffering alone. And I would have missed the opportunity to know you as you really are instead of as you pretend to be. I also want to apologize again," she continued, "for not being present earlier, for not seeing what was happening. But I also want to acknowledge that what you did for 2 years took incredible strength and sacrifice. That you helped your sibling when he needed help even though you were struggling yourself, is something that shows your character. But I also need you to understand that strength is not just about sacrifice. Strength is also about asking for help when you need it. Strength is also about setting boundaries. Strength is also about prioritizing your own well-being." And that's when I understood the real turning point of this story. The real turning point wasn't just about me getting help or taking medication or starting to recover from my depression. The real turning point was about my entire family learning what it means to truly support each other. Not through sacrifice but through honesty, through asking for help, through showing up for each other in the real, messy, difficult work of living together and caring for each other. The beautiful ending is that I'm here. I'm alive. I'm functioning. I'm working, I'm maintaining relationships, I'm creating things that matter to me, I'm taking care of myself. I'm not just surviving, I'm actually living. And Oliver is thriving. He's in his final years of secondary school now, and he's no longer the bullied kid who comes home every day looking like he's been through a war. He's a young person who has confidence in himself, who has friends, who has interests and goals and dreams for his future. And my parents have become the kind of people who ask the hard questions, who check in when something doesn't quite add up, who understand that you can't fix someone else's problems without taking care of your own mental health first. This is what recovery looks like. It's not a return to the way things were before. It's the slow, careful work of building something new and better and more honest. It's learning to live differently. It's learning to ask for help instead of suffering in silence. It's learning to say no instead of sacrificing yourself. It's learning that your own mental health and well-being are important and worth protecting. The story of my drowning while helping Oliver is a story about how depression can make you invisible, how you can be falling apart while everyone around you thinks you're fine, how sacrifice without support is really just slow self-destruction. But it's also a story about what happens when someone finally sees you, really sees you, and decides that your survival is important enough to prioritize. My mother's breakdown when she realized I'd been drowning was the moment everything changed. It was the moment she decided that my mental health mattered, that my well-being was a priority, that her daughter's survival was worth whatever effort it took. And that decision, that moment of clarity and love and fierce protection, gave me back my life. I'm alive because my mother finally saw me. And I'll be grateful for that for the rest of my life.